Paul, good afternoon, welcome.
It's great to be here.
We can't have you here without kicking off with something about the chaotic state of politics at the moment. We've got Keir Starmer coasting, I mean that in the nicest possible way. We've got Rishi Sunak making no imprint at all, in fact, losing it by the day. And then we've got the Reform Party sort of coming from nowhere, climbing up on the heels of Conservatives. What the hell is going on?
What's interesting about the Reform clawing their way up into double figures is I talk to quite a lot of people who do polling, and one of the things that they say is that don't assume that they're all Tories. Even though the Tories are losing, the graph goes, the Tory graph goes down, the Reform graph goes up. A lot of those people are the classic ex-Labour Red Wall voters. I'm from the north of England, as you can hear. A lot of people were never Tories, and they voted tactically for Johnson in 2019. And don't assume that it's the immigration politics of reform completely that it's driving them to that. There's a sort of anti-politics thing going on. We're sick of them all. So that's how I'd explain the reform thing. Sunak, he's just. I would say there is no project. The first project we'll deliver 5 things. They didn't deliver them. Then it was we'll change things, but they didn't deliver that. I mean, if you're obsessed with and worried about people crossing the channel, we've had one of the biggest days of that this week. It's just conservatism to me needs to kind of rethink itself and decide what it wants to be, and it can't be that when it's a beleaguered government losing probably about 1 or 2 MPs per month, either from quitting or getting chucked out of Parliament. It's just time for them to go. And fair enough, Sunak gets to choose when, but I kind of wish it was soon, because there are when we're going to talk about defence, cross-party, there are big issues and big decisions to be made about defence. The fag end of a government can't make.
Yeah, because there's a long-term play.
So much of defence is 5, 10, 20 years.
Yeah. So from a Keir Starmer point of view, then, I say he's coasting. I meant that positively. So I suppose he must be thinking, not what have I got to do to win, but what have I got to avoid doing to lose?
What everybody in Labour talks about is neither of the above. They talk about, can we execute in power? That's what they talk about. Yeah. And they know, because the way government has changed, even in the 14 years since Labour's been in power, is that it's an all or nothing game. You get so much access to everything. And when we talk about defence, it's really obvious. John Healey often says, he has a team of 4 people in an office, one of whom is an admin worker, and all very good and competent. And what the other one another is a press person. 4 people to mirror a department of 3,000 with no sightlines. But that's also true of Treasury. It's little, Labour's Treasury teams, maybe 40 or 50 people now. But it's preparing for government and then preparing to deal with what hits you. The moment you walk through any ministry, of course, as you know, you get 14 years worth of undisclosed information. And defence might not be the worst one, but it'll certainly be an interesting one for if John Healey, the Shadow Defence, walks in to find out what has been going on. So Labour worries about, obviously, can we win? There's a little bit of a worry because there are some left parties now standing. There are a few independent candidates who are very fired up over the Gaza issue that might take votes from them. But I think Labour's pretty confident it can win. But can they govern and make the difference they need to make up front? Because they don't have long. Liz Truss only had 49 days.
So can I pick up on the defence? So thanks very much for coming in.
It's a pleasure.
Defence is one of those issues that's close to my heart. And one of the reasons that we're really grateful for you to come in is that, not really from a political perspective, but defence feels like it's in a difficult position at the moment. The world feels like a more dangerous place than it's ever been. We're only spending 2% defence budget. Even the government is turning around and saying we want to spend more. But it feels like one of those moments where Labour's going to inherit an empty bank balance and a whole load of commitments. Defence is only one of them. How are they going to square that circle?
Well, let me just make clear that who I'm speaking for. I can only speak for myself. I'm a Labour member. I'm a journalist who openly supports Labour. I've tried to make the going a bit in terms of Labour's defence debates and sets set agendas, and this is a big agenda of mine. So when I say what I say in this podcast is my position only, not from anybody else. Late 1933, Japan and Germany had both walked away from the League of Nations and were quite obviously rearming. And a committee was set up in British government called the Defence Requirements Committee. It was civil servants, not politicians, plus the chiefs of the staff, the three services. And they made what I call a strategic determination. They said, Japan's a threat, Germany's a threat, we can't deal with both at the same time, so we're going to make no plans for war with Japan, and we're going to make plans to deter Germany. And that simple threat assessment and then determination is what I think has been missing from all of defence politics. You'll know the Integrated Review 2021, let's go off to the Far East. Well, then Afghanistan happened, then Ukraine happened. So Integrated Review Refresh 2023 recognises that Russia is a threat, but there's no machinery of government that says, right, we can see the new threat. Some of our allies are putting timescales on that. You'll know that the Bundeswehr is doing exercises about 3 years' time for an Article 5 crisis. British governance, whichever party is in power, needs to have to make a strategic determination. What's the threat? How soon is it coming? And what role are we going to play in NATO to deter it?
But I agree with that. My challenge back to you, though, would be that Putin is currently on the front foot in Ukraine. Operationally. And strategically, I would argue he's also on the front foot because he was gambling that the West would run out of steam. And it has.
It's running, but I'd push back.
So my point is that it'll be at least this government's not going to do anything about defence until the election. There will be a defence review. Nothing will enact from that for another year beyond that. So we're talking about at least 2 years.
Well, I think it's less than that. I think let's assume there's an election in October. Labour said it'll do a strategic defence review. And by the way, for those the military heads who watch this podcast, Labour's very clear it will be an SDSR, a strategic defence and security review, not the integrated review process that took place twice under the Tories. Because they see, John Healey has said this publicly, he sees the George Robertson 1998 Security and Defence Review as the gold standard because the challenge was public. That is, the opposition, various interested parties, experts were invited to stress test what the government's assumptions were. And these were, of course, peacetime assumptions, so it's not hard to stress test. I think Labour will do an SDSR. I hope it will do it fast. You've got to do it properly. But remember what Healey's already said. He said that it's a week one change to empower Chief of Defence Staff as the boss of the other three services. So that's a huge change, as you know, as ex-MOD. He said that's a week one change. There's no consultation. We're not going to put it out to a white paper. Week one, CDS becomes head of the armed forces.
What does he think the advantage of doing that will be?
So look, the British Army is doing an exercise called How We Fight 26. That's a scary title. How would we fight with what we've got in 2026? That's a brave thing to do, and it's a public thing they're doing. For me, the rationale behind what John Healey did in that speech, when he said, look, the MOD just must become a military strategic HQ, UK Stratcom sitting over in the countryside, it's not about where they sit, its functions must come to the centre of the MOD, and it must become really, John Healey doesn't say this, but I would say it, I think it needs to become a war-fighting ministry, because then you know what you're going to do. You're answering the same question as what the British Army is answering, how we fight.
But the Stratcom was originally designed, like Joint Forces Command before that, to be the brains, the warfighting in the MOD. The trouble is that it's all about money. It's all about where the money sits. The three services still have their own money.
Yep.
As a result, they're still buying ships, tanks and aeroplanes.
Yep.
They're tipping a nod to Chief of the Defence Staff, who's more at the political level.
Yeah.
So I'm just interested in how this empowerment, how it's actually going to change the dial.
I wouldn't be able to speak authoritatively about that, but how, if it were up to me, it would be something like this. It's just the MOD is a double-headed eagle, isn't it? It's an ordinary department of state that has to do human resources and that has to do budgeting and legal stuff, and then it's a military strategic HQ. And when you look at the way the Levine reforms, which were in 2011 under David Cameron, there were a lot of good things about Levine, and one of them was it set up Joint Forces HQ, which then became UK Stratcom. So it said, look, you need this thing, but it almost said, look, move it over here, not just physically, but sort of metaphorically. Move it over here so this department can get on with running itself efficiently, like a normal department. And that's fine in peacetime. But when you've got the tangible threat of peer-on-peer aggression, what you've got to do, I think, is to bring that war fighting and operations aspect of the MOD more to the centre. And those I've spoken to who are in favour of what Labour is proposing say they think it will help. But the other part of it is what Labour wants to do about procurement. Because under Levine, again for good reasons, procurement was devolved to the individual services. And there's a RUSI report that Royal United Services report that came out in 2020 that pointed out what this had done is it created a zero-sum game. So if the Air Force does some amazing productivity innovation and saves money, it loses money to another service. So Healy said in this policy exchange speech, I think it's 2 or 3 weeks ago, we're going to make a centralised procurement boss, the National Armaments Director, and they will say, as Britain did in 1933, to complete the thought, the Defence Requirement Committee in 33-34 said, okay, Germany first, Japan put on the long finger, and because of this, no Royal Navy, you can't have a Navy capable of fighting two powers at once, you can't have it. You won't get any more cruisers in short order, and no British Army, you're not going to have extra divisions that can fight in Europe. They actually ruled out fighting in Europe. And they said, what we are going to have is a big Royal Air Force capable not only of defending the UK, but hitting back in kind. And they started to spend hand over fist on obsolescent airframes, but they did, in that sense, the right thing. And I think that if Labour makes these two changes, and look, these are real nerd. I mean, even some of the defence correspondents who were in that press conference, they were going, how do I explain this to the 6 o'clock news? Because it's about the structure of the MOD. But it's important because it puts the UK in a position where it can think about how to fight, should that be, and how to deter, and then to think about making really difficult resource allocation decisions about procurement.
But Paul, and I'm sorry I'm pushing back a little bit here, but these grey hairs, 25, 30 years, some of it operating in MOD, as a seasoned operator, I have some sympathy with the journalists because I understand the system, and this still feels like tweaking with the deck chairs on the Titanic.
Right. Yeah.
Because bluntly, there are some ways that the money could be. I mean, Bern's got experience of DE&S and it moves at glacial paces. So how you sort technology out. There's undoubtedly polarised single service spending. But we were chatting on the way up here. One of the things really simply is how the Treasury, I remember being incentivised in MOD to buy overseas because if it was a little bit cheaper, it saved me money. Yet if you were to buy British, it might be more expensive, but the Treasury benefited hugely. The trouble is that money didn't go back to the MOD. It stayed in the Treasury. Yeah. So those sorts of changes would materially change.
What you've got, what you've got to do, and I think Labour's begun to do this. It's not completed its journey here. It says, and John Healy says it in every speech, build in Britain. No, build in Britain. About 80% of what the MOD spends on equipment is already spent in Britain. You get the odd leakage from the system. Fleet solid support getting built in Spain. I mean, those decisions were avoidable. But what Build in Britain is, it's a market signal. Because before we had a market signal which was called global competition by default. And it's really clear, that if there's a need for a new 155mm howitzer, one would expect there to be a global competition by default and a long-winded process, and the cheapest or the cheapest plus best wins. If you say build in Britain, what you're signalling to everybody, from Hanwha to Rheinmetall, whoever it is that whatever you're going to make is going to be made here. And that's something that the MOD moved towards in 2021 with the Defence and Security Industrial Strategy. But to my mind, they never enacted it. They never replaced a clear signal with another equal and opposite clear signal. So I think that's something that those in the defence community who are interested in this can already anticipate as coming out from the way Labour will govern. But you are absolutely right that these changes, these kind of day one changes or week one changes to centralised decision making are only the framework. The real question is, what's the decision? And here, I can speak only for myself. I would like us to take I would just like us to put behind the UK any idea that we can play an independent role in the Asia-Pacific arena. Our job in Asia-Pacific is probably to backstop the Americans by looking after the Red Sea if the Americans had to go somewhere else.
Before we go there, though,
Yeah.
Paul, can I just wind the clock back a little
Yeah.
bit? Because for some of our viewers and listeners, that one of the elephants in the room here is that not that long ago, the leader of the Labour Party
Yeah.
was pro-disarmament,
Yeah.
nuclear disarmament. And as we've been talking about before, if Ukraine had got nuclear
Yeah.
weapons, would Russia have attacked it?
Yeah.
So inevitably, I know that was yesterday and it's today, but what could you say about Labour's position?
Yeah, no, that's a great starting point actually. Before we get into the weeds of what to do, so I've been a Labour Party member since 1979, and I've got a pretty good understanding of its DNA. And the movement that put Jeremy Corbyn into the leadership was not a hard left movement. It was a bunch of people, especially the trade unions, who thought this party's just lost 2 elections against sitting duck targets. Actually, it could have been better. We all feared in the middle of the last decade something happening to us, which is in politics terms called PASOKification. There's a Greek Labour Party called PASOK, and it disappeared. It went from a ruling party to 4% in 3 years because it backed austerity, and there were way more people than Jeremy Corbyn fearing that after Ed Miliband lost, that we were going to disappear. The Dutch Labour Party had disappeared to about 4%, having been a ruling party. So we had to do something. So Corbyn comes in. The part of it that I supported was the economic radicalism, that you've got to be able to redistribute wealth, you've got to borrow to spend. I mean, Corbyn proposed in 2017 to borrow and spend 49 billion. I think Rishi Sunak in his first year borrowed and spent, in the COVID epidemic, borrowed and spent 300 billion. So it's it wasn't a massive amount, but borrowing and spending was the thing we wanted to do to reconnect with our base, to live our own values a bit. But yeah, inside Labour, it's got 2 traditions. There is and I'm not here talking about a Marxist anti-imperialist tradition, although there are people on the left who believe that. Remember, Keir Hardie, a kind of internationalist pacifist in favour of an international government. James Ramsay MacDonald, same basic ideology. We want international government and disarmament. A guy called George Lansbury, the next leader, was so pro-disarmament that he wanted to abolish the Royal Air Force. But so were 11 million people polled in the so-called peace referendum in 1932. So Labour has always had a strong element of that tradition. And who else came from that tradition was Clement Attlee. Attlee was one of the last British officers off the beach in Gallipoli, wounded in Iraq, very anti-war, wanted disarmament. 1935, he takes the Labour Party over. He can't bring them anywhere near disarmament. He couldn't even bring them to support the anti-fascist side in the Spanish Civil War to intervene. By 1937, he's on the front line. He's in the trench in the Spanish Civil War, not fighting but visiting the troops. And he had moved Labour completely into what we wouldn't call it a militaristic position, but more of an anti-fascist position. That he said, pacifism and reliance on the League of Nations doesn't work when these things are falling apart. We have to become pro-rearmament. I liken that to what happened to the German government at the beginning of the Ukrainian crisis. It's had what we call a Zeitenwende, a change of time. And I think Labour's well gone through that Zeitenwende under Keir Starmer. I mean, Jeremy going was fortuitous. It was a clean break. You know, I tried to support him. I tried to front up the arguments a bit in the media. But we all could see that on national security, he was coming from a much different place than the rest of us. And had we won, we'd have had to rely on the machinery of government to make sure that would...
I'm a student of history as well, and I love that historical reference. But bluntly, we've lost trust in politics, it feels, in this country.
Right.
And part of what we're talking about with defence is in your DNA.
Yeah.
It's what your belief is.
Absolutely.
But you're electing a government that's not just going to deliver this. You've got to trust them.
That's right.
And that's when I get into the DNA of defence. If the DNA of defence is actually whatever we're around, but actually our gut is that we don't need...
Right. You put your finger on the exact problem. I do my best, and many of us do in Labour. I'm on the left of the Labour Party, but so was a guy called Nye Bevan, the guy who set up the I keep talking history, but it's relevant, set up the NHS. And Aaron Bevan was expelled from Labour in the late 30s for wanting to form an anti-fascist front with Churchill to fight the Nazis. So the left has skin in the game on defence. Nye Bevan also was very pro joining NATO, in fact the formation of NATO, and famously, from his famous speech, naked into the conference chamber, the bomb. He was pro the bomb. So the Labour left has always had a side of it that says when push comes to shove, we will outshout the Conservatives on the need for defence, the need for rearmament, and the Labour sort of centre, the sort of traditional social democratic, they've always had a very strong defence culture. Again, you think back, Dennis Healey, Labour's standout defence secretary of the post-war era.
Today, it's a more dangerous world than we've seen for ages. And
what's the DNA?
I've been approached by people at Skype all around saying, are we on the verge of World War III?
No,
We've got the army talking about conscription.
Yep.
And so this feels very real.
Yeah, and
whoever comes into power,
yeah,
there is this sense of huge responsibility, and particularly as an ex-military guy, you rely on your politicians to make good judgments in very difficult situations. It's that DNA that I want to try and just...
Yeah, okay.
Today's DNA, because it's in living memory. Corbyn's still there. Keir Starmer was a supporter of Jeremy. He's now putting himself in a position to make these decisions.
Yes, and so was I. But let's make it really clear. Starmer said never again does Labour go into an election not trusted on defence. Okay. And he's done from the very get-go. Him and John Healey have gone out of their way to make really clear, the support for NATO is unshakable. The support for the nuclear deterrent is non-negotiable. Okay. So that there are people in the party who probably disagree with the latter. There are still people who cling to the idea that we can, in this circumstance, somehow nuclear disarm. But no, I'd say Starmer has led the mainstream of Labour opinion to a very good place on all of this, where I'm not worried. And I am a hawk on Ukraine. As you'll hear, I'm a hawk on rearmament. I'm not worried about Labour's DNA on that. The concern I would have is when we come to, there will be armed conflict. Let's hope it's not with Russia. There could be peripheral armed conflict. You look at what France is currently threatening to do. France is currently saying, if the Russians crank up what they've got, the kit they've got in Transnistria, which is this breakaway illegitimate republic from Moldova, then French troops probably would go bilaterally, because Moldova's not a NATO country. That's where I would say you're not worried about sort of 10, 15, 30 left-wing Labour MPs. You're worried about whether people have really thought that through, who in their heart of hearts would wish it wouldn't happen. And I think what we've all got to do with our electoral candidates of all parties, because by the way, this is true of all parties.
I'm not. I say we said at the start. We're not pointing. It's just that we are closing in on a time when I suspect some of our political leaders are going to have to make some very difficult decisions.
Me too.
Whether you mentioned Macron said we're not going to write off putting troops on the ground in Ukraine. Even the former defence secretary said we shouldn't take it off the table. Now, God forbid that happens. None of us want to see that happen.
No.
But as a leader, there's some difficult decisions sometimes that need to be made.
And I think that I am certain that Starmer is up to it. Okay. I am certain that, I know both people, I sat around a table this size with Keir Starmer when he launched his leadership campaign I'm not a close person to Starmer, but I was in that at that moment, and I think that he's got the mettle to do that. You look what he's done on Gaza, to great pressure and unpopularity from within parts of his own party. He's had nerves of steel actually on that, and I think he would in that situation. Ditto John Healey, and in fact the whole front bench. In terms of taking people with you, it's about. I think the next phase of this is we're not helped by the fact that nobody in politics wants to say what you just said. I'll say it, you probably say it, we could all say it on a podcast. Very few. General Sir Patrick Sanders did us all a favour by laying it out a bit in that speech. But that speech infuriated Downing Street. There were rumours that he was going to be sacked. He wasn't sacked, but he's gone. He's out the building. And Downing Street briefed these from memory. They said something like, "These scenarios are unhelpful." Well, they're not. We need to be able to explain to the British electorate that exactly what you said. There could be moments where one of the scenarios is that a coalition of willing countries secures the Belarusian-Ukraine border with non-combatant troops. There's no fighting going on. The other one is a no-fly zone, which would necessarily be a no-fly zone for anything, including Shahid drones and the rest, in west of the river Dnipro. Do I know anybody in Labour who's actively thinking about it? No, but we're going to have to start. And
that's a thing. Bill and I've both got loads of questions. But for me, one of those is that we don't have the time. So I am relatively downbeat about Ukraine at the moment. For 2 years, we gave Western weapons. They got on the front foot. Yep. We ran out of the weapons we could give them. We're talking about artillery shells now. They're dumb weapons. They need smart weapons. Yep. Russia's on the front foot. US has tied up 60 billion. Doesn't look likely that's going to flow. The Europeans have given a load of money, but it's not many weapons in there. No. You're into mass on mass. Russia is pushing forward. Yep. And I think all of a sudden you're going, either Western leaders continue the political rhetoric, but don't do anything, or they have to look at what's available. No-fly zone is one of the options on the table. One of them is putting boots on the ground. One of them is actually sending high-tech weapons. There's lots of things we could do, but this is going to hit whoever's there.
You need proactivity.
People are already thinking about it. That's the thing.
Yeah. And what I would say is that I both on the defence spending issue and on the options for Ukraine, what would really help is if you'll notice something. The defence teams on either side of the House of Commons are very friendly with each other. They're adversarial, but when Ben Wallace was there, John Healey always said, he briefs me in as much as he can. There was a great tribute to James Heapy, the Armed Forces Minister who quit by Labour front bench. And the reason for that is they know that we're in the same thing. The problem we have is that neither the politicians in power, nor the opposition, nor the defence chiefs want to lay it on the line about what the options are. And I think that what we can't do is surprise the British people with a bunch of sudden options that are laid on the table. I would like to, including through this podcast, get it out there that we may have to suddenly
why not?
do
Can
this.
I just challenge though? So you talked about the 1930s. This whole thing about appeasement feels like we're being appeasing Putin. He rattles the nuclear sabre and we all cower away and he carries on doing what he's doing.
The invisible red lines that have been drawn by Germany and America are different lines. So first of all, the German one is irrational, that because they've convinced themselves that they will be targeted for some reason if Taurus is used against the Kerch Strait Bridge. America's red lines, I think, are very much to do with the electoral cycle. They cannot afford, same as the way they handled the Red Sea, the way they handled the Houthis and the Hezbollah threat, has been to say, please, to everybody, de-escalate, because we can't go into an election in the threat of Trump. By the way, the threat of Trump winning is he walks away from NATO, switches off various sensors in the sky, takes the American generals out of the NATO command structure. That's a threat. And so I think there's a holding pattern I hope there's a holding pattern from America. I wouldn't see it as appeasement, but I would say that there is an unfinished or unstarted debate in NATO military circles about how we actually are going to match Putin rung for rung on the escalation ladder. Because Putin is in escalation mode. If he does manage a proper breakthrough, a proper manoeuvre breakthrough somewhere in Ukraine, then a town or a city will be taken, people will be tortured, raped, killed, the horrible stuff. And at that point, the other thing with Transnistria, and why
but those sort of examples have happened.
They have.
So if it happens again, it's not new.
No, it would be.
I don't know why it would trigger a different response.
No, it would be. It would be if it were major enough. It were a big civilian centre like Kharkiv, which is it's only 30 kilometres away from the front line. It's look. Where I'm going with this is, I think as you say, there will come a point where big decisions might have to be taken by Western governments proactively. They may not be NATO decisions. They may be coalition of the willing type decisions. One of them would be if Putin declared Transnistria Russian territory. Because if he did that, he's basically saying, and then there's about a brigade's worth of kit stored in Transnistria. I went there undercover during 2014 when the Crimea crisis was on, and it's a bizarre place. Moldova's dirt poor. You cross the border, and Transnistria is very rich, and all the tarmac roads are beautifully smooth. There's no traffic on them. Lots of world-class football players playing for football teams with no supporters. But if that brigade's worth of kit suddenly started rolling into Moldova, triggered by a sort of coup in Moldovan capital Chisinau, and then you said, well, we're not having this. Putin says, sorry, Transnistria is Russia, and that means if you set foot in there, nuclear. We don't have a public debate. I don't know what the public or private position of the UK government would be if that happened. And I think we should get there pretty damn fast. I think we should be saying to the population, we are going to draw lines for this guy, and we're not going to let him cross them. And if it needs a coalition of willing countries to do it, let's do it. Like Ben Wallace did with HMS Defender in the Black Sea in 2021. It was a Defender, wasn't it? Just sent a Type 45 destroyer 5 miles off Crimea to see what would happen. I want our politicians to have the guts to do that. And my job is to argue for it inside Labour. Others' job inside Tory and Lib Dems would be, and the SNP would be to argue in their parties.
I'll come back to this in a minute.
Yeah, so I come at this as a punter. And what I want, whoever the government is, but let's assume it's Keir Starmer leading it, when I hear the words SDSL, I go cold. Because that gives politicians an opportunity to say, well, I'm sorry, I can't answer that question until the review's done.
Yeah.
What I want somebody on day 2 to be strong on a number of things, and defence is one of them.
Yeah.
Now, the Americans have got something called the executive order, so you can pile on big decisions very quickly.
Yeah.
My question would be, what can a Labour government, what can Keir Starmer do early to send a very, very strong message to people like me that we've got a grip, and also a strong message to other, would-be enemies?
The way it works is that they're going to ask their civil servants and military chiefs what those options might be. Because if you want to do something proactive, if something bad is happening at the moment where and it might be, because here's the thing, both for the American election and for our election, these are perfect time points for Putin to try something. And so if something bad is going on, you'd want him to react very strongly to it. If you're asking what can we do proactively, I think that's where you go in and you say on day one to the military chiefs, what have you got in the locker? What is there? I mean, I presume there are options that are, and again the timing of it. Suppose the UK election is in mid-October, and then
I think Bern's point though is less about military actions. It's been even the news. I think it was today or yesterday. They said that the world, the West, is desperately looking for leadership.
Yeah.
And we've got none at the moment. We've got a government who's not in power.
Yeah, and Sunak is not that interested in Ukraine. I mean, I think the Labour front bench is interested in Ukraine, and it's desperate to get its hands on stuff it can do. But here's the thing, and again, some of your viewers might not realise this. There's an assumption that because we have a Privy Council, that Labour politicians somehow are taken inside the Beltway and told what's going on. It's not true. No. They are going to be reliant on the civil servants and the military chiefs to tell them, real picture. What's a real picture of what's going on? Because I wouldn't be confident that I could tell you what the real picture of Ukraine is right now, and to give options for proactivity, to send signals to us. I think it's just about making clear statements, like Macron has done. I'm quite happy to see any Western politicians, Keir Starmer included, make the kind of statements Emmanuel Macron has done, because those signals, as you know from the deterrence theory, are very important for deterrence.
I agree with you, but Macron has gone from being one side of the fence, appeasing and being Putin's best friend. So there's a lack of consistency when he suddenly, and everybody's going, why is he doing that? It's obviously self-serving in some respects. Keir Starmer doesn't have any of that backdrop. He could, even from a position at the moment, be building a sense that I'm not a man to be messed with. Putin's a bully on the world stage. I am not privy to all the options available.
And the good thing is he's unknown.
Yeah.
He's been seen as a leader of an opposition party, never been seen as a leader. So actually, he's got no baggage at all in a way.
It's true. And I'd say go back and look at what he did over Gaza. There was a quite obvious decision, because when the Gaza the atrocity took place, and then in a few weeks after that, it coincided with a crisis inside the government, and so the feeling inside the top Labour circles was probably we could be in power quite quickly. We could be in power while this is in its hot phase, and therefore the last thing we can do is start signalling either. We can't signal anything really that's different. We have to triangulate between what Biden is doing and what Sunak is doing, because otherwise the shaky allies and the adversary in the Middle East is going to look at Labour as a weak link and say, oh well, we can wait 3 weeks and then this guy's going to come in and we'll push him around. And I think the way Starmer reacted, which annoyed a lot of his own mass base in the party, was driven by that feeling. And I would expect that assumption to be something that you would get from a Labour government. That is, we're up for whatever expert advice tells us needs to be done, but we are not going to walk in with some kind of gung-ho, we thought of this up in our, sitting on our beanbags, with no information. That would be irresponsible.
It was more the leadership line. But can I just go back to, you talked about Trump and you talked about NATO. There's an interesting, when he first talked about threatening to leave NATO, if you actually strip back the rhetoric, which occasionally you just want to slap bloody Trump the way he says stuff, but actually behind the rhetoric, you go, Europe is under attack. 11 of the 32 members of NATO pay their way, despite the fact 10 years ago they all committed that we're all going to pay our way.
Yep.
So the vast majority do not pay their way. America, by far the biggest budget, 3.5%. And it doesn't seem wrong that they turn around and say,
no,
look, this is on your doorstep. We're not international rescue. And in a way, that plays to us as well. One of the answers is the answer for us to keep ramping up our defence spending, or is NATO an essential pillar of that? Why shouldn't we put in more pressure on our partners and colleagues in NATO to step up? Because otherwise, they're not paying their insurance premium. We're paying it for them.
I mean, the problem we've got is that we are, on some measures, we are barely paying it. I think it's there's a Swedish institute, SIPRI, that measures an objective measure of who spends what, and they kind of say, you're probably spending about 2.2. Okay, so that's not spectacular, but I'm afraid that we lost a lot of moral authority with Brexit, and Brexit and European security. The EU and European security aren't the same thing. NATO is the vehicle for European security, but the Brits lost loads of leverage. They've lost leverage by having army cuts, by having a huge capability gap on land. They've lost leverage by. I mean, AUKUS is a great thing, and I back it, and the Labour Party backs it big time. You bet it backs both pillars of AUKUS. The kind of submarine and then the whizzy tech bit. But unfortunately, that was a big diplomatic moment, wasn't it? Because we then lost a lot of goodwill with France that we're going to have to rebuild. One of the things that Labour wants, and I think it wants it early, is a security pact with the EU. So the security pact with the EU is essential, actually, both for creating the conditions for mutually beneficial rearmament. Why? The EU has just issued a defence industrial strategy, which says we're going to. So intra-EU defence trade is something like 6%. They all buy from America. They don't buy from each other. Then you've got the classic thing that what is called a striker in America is called something else here and something else here, and they've all got one slightly different bit. And it wouldn't matter to a soldier getting into it, but they're not certifiable across borders. One cannot be certified as a combat vehicle in another country. So the EU's just decided to blow all that away. They're going to have a Europe-wide defence industrial strategy, encourage cross-border mergers, cross-border production agreements. Labour is very clear that I think we have to be part of that at the price of leaving or in any way undermining key Anglo-American programmes. But, we've got this thing now. Rheinmetall and BAE are building the turrets of the Challenger 3 in Telford. We're putting them on old hulls. When we run out of hulls, what are we going to do? We're going to have a hull factory, or are we going to say things like, and this is purely me speaking, not Labour, join the Leopard programme? Could the British Army just join the Leopard tank programme? Now, to do so, suddenly you're in the world of European defence industrial strategy. So you need a clear position on that. You need a clear position on European Security Pact, so that Europeans don't feel that we're going to come in, slap them around, and kind of make them feel small, and then say we're walking away from something we slightly did.
You're almost answering my next question, which is Trump was playing hardball with the rest of NATO. Step up, or we walk away.
Labour's
like that, but
Britain's
it
not in a
sounds like
position
you're
to do that.
looking to do the opposite. And
Britain is not in a position to play hardball with Europe, but with Poland spending 3%,
3.5% now, I think it is. Yeah.
And buying Korean stuff hand over fist. The French have always had a very strong indigenous defence industry. The Nordics, we had to go cap in hand for the naval strike missile. We went cap in hand to Sweden for Archer. We're not in a position to say to them, hey, everyone, do what we say. What I think we can do is lead by example. And I think that it might make you cold, the SDSR, but if we can do it fast and do it in an exemplary way, and it has an outcome that I hope will lead to a case being made for a rise in defence spending, of significant rise, then we could set a bit of a trend there. But I think everything, it's a sequence. October, British election. November, fingers crossed for me, Biden wins. If Biden doesn't win and if there's chaos, then the first thing you're going to be wanting Keir Starmer to do is to talk to Macron about how do we hold the fort for 4 years as the joint moral leadership of NATO together, because Britain won't do it on its own.
So do you think actually Trump would walk away?
I don't think he can't walk away from NATO because they're signatories to the North Atlantic Treaty. Yeah. What he could do is, I was speaking to someone who, and like you know this better than me, who said, we've probably got adequate sensors in Europe to see ballistic missiles attacking us, but only the Americans have got sensors that could see hypersonic missiles. And you could say, Trump would simply have to say, well, you know what, those are not available anymore. There are people around Trump who say he's going to be more professional this time. There's more of a sort of ordinary politics rather than nutcase politics base to Trump. I don't know. I don't trust that. Ukraine, if he pulls the plug on Ukraine, then what happens doesn't really matter whether we've got Storm Shadow or Scalp or Taurus. Then there'll be a lot of angry men with severe PTSD wandering around looking for someone to blame with a gun. And that'll be Ukraine. And Eastern Europe will be a venue for mass refugee flows. And the British government, whoever it is, will be addressing that problem, not a front foot problem to do with Ukraine. So all one can hope is, and I think that I would try and reassure your viewers, Starmer is not a career politician, but he's learned a lot in I think it's 9 years since he became a politician, since he entered Parliament. And I certainly had the chance to see him up close early on in his leadership campaign, and he's of the caliber that can do it. But then you've got to surround yourself with people who are also of that calibre.
But you can understand why I'm pushing you a little bit
No,
on this,
absolutely.
only because, for all sorts of obvious reasons, what the Labour Party and Keir Starmer has been very careful is not to commit to spending on anything, not to commit around numbers. And I can understand why. I'd much rather they did, but I can understand why. The danger is that means you're nothing to everybody. And the danger is something as serious. Yes, healthcare is serious. There's lots of things that are serious. But it just feels we're here to talk about defence, and it just feels we need a bit more than that at the moment. My link question to that is Ben Wallace seemed to have quite a lot of cross-party respect as Defence Secretary. He was a former soldier. James Heappey was also a former soldier. The jury's out for me, but what's your view about whether military experience is value in those sorts of roles?
A very experienced former intelligence officer said to me, who'd worked with them, said, they're brilliant at understanding battle, but I'm not certain they understand war. Because war's a political question. I know that may or may not have been unfair. I've never worked with either of them. The appearance of sort of battalion level and company level commanders in politics is good, and I wish Labour on our side had more of that in all the services, and from all the services. And it is a deficiency of Labour that we haven't. We will have. There'll be several, both from the military world and the sort of feisty end of the Foreign Office type world. There were some good Labour candidates in this, and they will get elected. So there'll be a cadre of people who know what they're talking about, know what the language is. But in the end, you're asking politicians. Strategy is the interface between politics and war. You're asking them to be strategists. And how do you become a strategist? Well, you can go to Shrivenham. You can go on the higher staff command course.
I was there just this morning.
But politicians don't get to go on those courses. They get thrown in, almost like they get thrown on day one, on that level of reality, realism, granularity, with very little experience. And so one of the things that I know is going on in Labour is that the candidates are being trained and educated around things like deterrence and concepts. And I think it's just the way the party system works. When Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister, having been the Treasury guy, and then not much else before that, he had the same problem. If there are people watching this who will be making these decisions in 10 years' time, what my advice to them would be, cut some of the party politics out of it and try and create almost a French-style école supérieure system where somebody in politics can apply to go on something like, there's a course called RCDS, which is the
and High Command of Staff course. There's two. The High Command of Staff is much shorter. RCDS is a year long,
and RCDS can be aimed at civilians and civil servants.
Yeah, absolutely right.
And so you'd want people to be able to go on something like that to prepare themselves to take the strategic decisions they need to take. And we are going to walk into this conflict a little bit naked of politicians who have that experience, but then they're surrounded by experienced people.
One of the challenges that we are not good sometimes in the military is making sure the politicians understand that it isn't just about contracts for tanks. We've also got to look after our people.
Absolutely.
And that investment. And everybody says it.
Yeah.
But we're not very good at doing it sometimes.
Let's talk about money. We should talk about money. So I'm doing some research at the moment on, and you're right, Labour, there's no way Labour will talk money before the election. Partly because what's happening in successive budgets and autumn statements is that the Tories are kind of giving tax break. I mean, it would cost you to do 2.5% of GDP defence spending would, on my calculation, cost you less than 10 billion. And yet Rishi Sunak gave 10 billion away in national insurance. So he says he has an aspiration to spend 2.5 when fiscal conditions allow. Fiscal conditions came along and allowed it, and he didn't do it. We've got to break out of that. So my rule of thumb, and I think this might be useful for your viewers, because the calculations are about right, 2.5% is about another 9 or 10%, 10 billion a year, on top of, say, notional 60. It isn't 60 in the budget, but let's say it's about 60 in reality. Because the MOD budget is very strange. They spend money they don't have. 60 billion baseline, 10 billion a year on top of that is 2.5%. 25 billion a year on top of that is 3%. 100 billion on top of that is 6%, which just happens to be where Britain got to before World War II. It went from 2.5% to 6%.
Yeah, but Margaret Thatcher's time, it's 4%.
Absolutely.
And there was often a read across that people, I mean, Grant Shapps stood on the steps of the same stage that Margaret Thatcher did and said it's a more dangerous world than it was then. And you went, somebody put
so
their
where's
hand
the
up
money?
and said, where's the 4% then?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, it's about
Right,
how you
look,
spend money. And it's worse than that because just to pick, I mean, unfortunately, I know a lot about this. The 2%, 2.2, whatever it actually is, for also historical reasons, also includes the deterrent.
Yeah.
That normally is about 6% of the defence budget. But this next 10 years...
It's going to be huge.
41 billion extra capital spend as they replace it, no extra money.
Absolutely.
So that's going to squeeze
It'll
even
squeeze
further.
All right. I am part of a sort of wide-ranging group of people inside Labour who want to... I know why we can't make an advanced determination of the money until suppose the Conservatives came in autumn, just before the election, said, all right, 2% next year. I can't see it in any way that Labour would, having said don't cut the army, they couldn't say don't do that. But what you can't do with, there's two things. You've got to be fiscally responsible. You can't go throwing out 2.5% here, 3% here, or 10 billion, 25 billion here, and not say where it comes from. So that's the fiscal side of it. On the force design and capability design, you can't say it without you have a proper threat assessment. And our problem with Integrated Review 2023 is that it wasn't really a thorough threat assessment. It didn't say who, what, when, why, where. If we can, this is the sequence that I think is in the minds of Labour politicians. We've got to get procurement right, because you could up it to 70 or 80 billion a year and just, let's not use the vernacular, but you could pour it down the drain of stupidity. Procurement right, centralised procurement, so you take really clear decisions like the 1933-34 ones. No big navy, this was their decision, no big navy, big air force. I'm not saying that's what you would do now. Right. Get procurement right, make the threat determination, make the case for what there is, and then the argument. The Treasury in the 30s had a bad reputation and was accused of promoting appeasement. But one of the reasons it did try to limit rearmament is because it said you can't deter with a bankrupt country. It's not well known that the first time there was a defence loan raised of 400 million in 1936, the first public statement that we're going to rearm through borrowing, that gilt issue failed. It failed. Nobody knew this at the time because it was kept secret. Not enough gilts were bought by the private sector, and so the Bank of England had to buy them. And so the worst fears of the Treasury were coming true secretly. Today, there'd be no secret. They'd be out there on the wires the next minute. So you've got to get that right as well. If you're going to do anything through expanding public spending, you've got to get the finance of it right. And I'm somebody in the Labour Party who's putting that argument. I think 3% is the minimum, because 2.5% just fills gaps, plugs the capability gaps, and it doesn't even plug the black hole in the equipment budget. 3 gives you some choices. Above 3 starts giving you lots of choices, but it gives you a problem. We haven't got the industrial capacity to produce and to absorb the money. I would, no-brainer, who was it? Someone from the Royal United Services Institute did a survey of this, and they estimated to bring forces pay up to market rates and to stop the drain would be about 2 billion a year. So I'd say that no-brainer, because without people, or with demotivated people, or people looking at the exit, as you say, it's not the same as having people highly focused on that job. If we then invest in the defence industry, and through AUKUS, we're now saying 7,000 jobs in Cardiff and Glasgow. Right, well, who do you think is going to have those jobs? What we don't want is a huge extra drain coming from the armed forces into the defence industry without being able to replace
Can I
them.
just, I know, sorry, just one more, and then is just picking up on that money bit. I'm just pushing back a bit. Of course, I'd love to hear 3. I'd love even more to hear 4, but 3 is good. And without holding you to account at where, but are you saying that would be borrowed money rather than
I would advocate that you borrow it, because that's what there's no better. 3% would cost 3p on VAT or 3p on income tax. It's a lot. And both of those things would have adverse effects on the economy because everything would go up in price, inflation, people's income would go down. But 3%, if you borrowed it, by my calculations, debt to GDP would peak around 100% and it would fall in the fifth year, which is what the famous target is, to about 96%. It's not going to be breaking the bank. It's not Italian levels of debt.
Thank you.
So, but can I just finish the point about this? The question is, even on 3%, it's not a lot. And therefore, what depends on what the threat is. If somebody came to me and said, the threat is Putin's walked away from Ukraine and we have to keep Ukraine going for 4 years, I'd say, right, well, we need basic ammunition factories, we need complex weapons factories, we need output 24 hours a day. Some of these factories that close down, reopen them, remake the NLAWs, make the Javelin, all of that. If it was that. If it was intelligence says that Putin could go to war with a NATO ally within 3 years, I'd forget all that and I'd go capability. I might say integrated air and missile defence, number one. Just defend ourselves.
Yeah, I think with a bottle of wine on the table, we would have a very good discussion about this because for me, it's not just the cheats way out is to just pour more money in. It's like the NHS. You've got to find there are so many other things that we could do smarter, whether it's with our NATO colleagues spending more money and that way having a much more coherent defence industrial strategy. But
I think that's my concern. So I'm in business and people will come to me and say, we want to increase our budgets. And I can say, what are you going to spend it on? So I could be completely wrong, but my worry is that we've started to wind down from a military point of view over a number of years. If you just put a whole load of money in, somebody's got to spend it. It takes a long time to spend money properly in defence.
Yep, and that's so the time to change this was yesterday. That's the problem. The time to change this was a long time ago. And Johnson, to be fair, pumped 24 billion capital spend into the MOD budget, but it just disappeared into the black hole. It was said by Tobias Ellwood, the chair of the Defence Select Committee, it has gone. It didn't even touch the sides. So business plans have to be sequenced. Sort the procurement system out fast. Centralise procurement. Assess the threat, make the case for extra spending. I would argue, make the case for debt-financed rearmament. It's not going to break the bank. It's not going to break most of the fiscal rules. Other countries are doing. Europe's raising apparently 100. This is proposed 100 billion euro bond, which is pooled debt instrument. If they do it, and the Americans can spend off the side of a desk, can't they? And we don't. Our strategic advantage begins to diminish. So we're going to do that. But you're absolutely right. You don't make the argument, I need to spend something and I'll tell you later what it is. You've got to make the argument, we desperately need the following. But then what does desperately need mean? You could probably speed up Type 26 frigates. You could probably, it might be better to just commit to the whole F-35B purchase and start negotiating with the Americans, when can we have some? Might be, I don't know about whether the Typhoon can carry on production, for longer. But ultimately, if it came to a bad situation, you'd just want people on the ground capable of deterring. And so that's people, isn't it? People with tubes, and boots. Unfortunately, that's just not our capacity to produce. That has been squandered. Where would we get more NRAPs? Where would we get more tanks? We've only got 148 holds left. So what are we going to do? The Warrior, there's no replacement. Ajax, no one knows if it really works. This is not a great position to be picking up if you're John Healey going on day one. What the heck am I actually
back to
picking?
What a great opportunity for leadership. What a great opportunity for a statement. A great opportunity to say, this is a build. This isn't just to throw money. It's a defence industrial strategy. Here's how we're going to do this.
Yeah.
And I like what you said right at the beginning, or near the beginning. And okay, so we got, there'll be potentially, based on what you said, there'll be shared developments, across Europe, including Britain. But also, the saying to Rheinmetall, CEO of Rheinmetall, okay, you're going to build this stuff, but by the way, you're going to build it in Britain. Look,
I think Rheinmetall's one thing. We've got to replace the SA-80, the Army's assault rifle, within 2-3 years. That's a thing, isn't it? There's probably one factory in Britain that could make small arms. I think FN have got a factory in Britain that could make them. But you're going to have to say, anybody who wants to do this, it's not. These things are not going to be made somewhere else. They're going to be made here. They're going to make the jobs here, jobs in places that you don't see a lot of defence spending. There are regions of Britain that are not getting a lot of MOD spend. So you could do that, but ultimately, if it's, forgive me language, kick, bollock and scramble, and there's a three year to Armageddon, you just go, we go with what we have, we gear the industrial base to survive. If it's not that, if it's 5, 10, 15 years, and the threat is more amorphous, then GCAP, which, the GCAP's meant to be flying by 2035. If we had a world-beating 6th generation combat aircraft, and we don't even know whether it's an aircraft or a cloud of drones or whatever it is, if we had that as an insurance policy, if we had integrated air missile defence as an insurance policy, and if we had 10 attack submarines, capital ships of the 21st century, and enough people staffing them to really convince the adversary that we mean business, and politicians who never waver from the message of we mean business, and I mean no politician should be wavering from it, then one would hope that's the optimal scenario, because it gives us time to build the industrial base. If you had to,
but that industrial base has got to be credible. I mean, you use the example, build it in Britain, then you built the SA-80 up. Actually, when that first came in, unfortunately, I remember this a lot before it. When it first came in, it was a bit of a nightmare.
It was, yeah.
And you sort of go, in a way, build British. We're old enough to remember British Leylanders was build British,
no.
But they weren't always that good.
No.
Now, when you're talking about military equipment,
it's got to be.
As somebody who spent 2 years in Afghanistan, it's not Toy Town.
No,
we need stuff
that's
be bloody good.
Yeah, yeah.
And therefore, I want to be built in Britain, but we've also got to make sure it's really
Look,
good.
There's no intellectual property in Britain to replace the SA-80. No. There's I noticed that Sig Sauer had bought a UK company, Sig Sauer, the small arms manufacturer. That to me seems like a sensible thing to do. The big small arms manufacturers are anticipating that contract coming up under any government, and they know that it's not. If you really wanted, you could go on. There's 500 million assault rifles, 500 million AR-15s knocking around in the private sector in America. You could go and get some.
I was going to say, in America are in superstores, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. But if we want to build up an industrial base, we've got to decide what part of it we want. We can't have everything. So we're obviously very good at submarines. We've still got a Sheffield Forge Masters that can make bits of submarines that bolt together. We are incredibly good at combat air. Apparently, we're good at offensive cyber, but nobody knows what it is for quite obvious reasons. But for the rest of it, we've lost our land, our land engineering capability, and land now is it's GBAD, it's air defence. Land now is surface-to-surface missiles. Land could be, and Tony Radican said this, land could be Royal Marines with anti-ship missiles on land. So, I'd be wanting us to do more there, but that's just me. And those discussions go on. They go on among politicians of all parties, including backbenchers, who are very interested in all this. But until Labour gets some sightlines into Realityville, they're not going to. The worst thing they could do is to come with a kind of shopping list of things that they want that don't match what the military wants.
Pebble in your pond, just for the future. One of the things, having served, most of the things we talked about are hardware, ships, tanks, and aeroplanes. Most of the military training that creates operational effectiveness used to be done in the live environment, and you've got to be really careful not to damage the aircraft. There's safety everywhere.
Yeah.
Nowadays, most of it's done in high-tech sims.
Yeah.
The one thing that defence has been rubbish about is linking those sims together so you can do coordinated joint, not just national but international exercises. That needs some pushing, because the stovepipes stop it happening. It could offer huge savings to defence. It's the way to do operation training, and also we can export some of that capability because we can be a hub. We have some fantastic technology in this country.
Thing. I didn't know that.
And we need to be pushing that.
Yeah, that's a great point. But I think, look, the people listening to this all have one thing that the same as the politicians have. They have a vote. And they have kind of a voice as well. I know that Labour politicians are very open to hearing from people in the defence world, both serving, of course, people who are serving can't speak to politicians.
Yes.
But people who've just served can, and people's families can. And it's, if you want this to happen, be on the case. Politicians are receptive there's very few people now thinking there's no problem. There's no problem. Why we're spending all this money on defence? They know it's a terribly dangerous world, and it's making the case for serving in the armed forces is something that I'd like to see all politicians do more. Making the case for the defence industry is something that I try and do. We've got this thing called ESG. Environmental, social and corporate governance investment principles that militates against investment funds and pension funds from investing in defence. We've got to scrub that, and I think that you've got to because there's a capital shortage for defence industries. Let's do some of that. I know that's part. I think it's likely that either government Tory government has said they're going to sort out ESG. Labour will probably do it. I think. But you need to have your, not just you two, but the people who are watching this have a voice.
But in many ways, that's why I think I'm very grateful, both very grateful for you coming in, because it's all very well saying that. But I think a lot of military, when they leave, have become deeply cynical.
And I don't blame them.
And therefore, they sort of go, I mean, we've shared, one of the themes of the podcast regularly is that, a slightly cynical view of what actually motivates our politicians. And when the serving military leave, most of them nowadays will have lost colleagues on operations.
Absolutely.
They will look at our withdrawal from Afghanistan. They will look at some of the decisions that our masters have made, and they will just become very cynical. And therefore, when those political potential masters want help, they look and go, oh, really?
Yeah.
Whereas actually having a proper debate, which is really grateful for your time.
And the frustrating thing is that I can do it because I'm just a journalist.
Yeah.
I'm a politically engaged journalist and politically connected journalist. But the more the viewers of this podcast and people who in the armed forces who through intermediaries speak about what the real needs are, I'd say speak up, because the politicians want to know. They do want to know. Of course, they'll hear the stories about how bad things are and how terrible the accommodation is. They kind of know that, but I think we should all remind ourselves that this country has an incredible record in times of danger and threat of coming together, and the most unlikely people stepping up, people who've not been friends with each other, people who've been on different sides of the divide. One of the things I am keen to do is to create a cross-party movement for rearmament. It shouldn't be a dirty word, and no politician really wants to use the word rearmament. They might want to say increased defence spending. That's not the same as rearming. And in the 30s, from 1935 onwards, they did say rearmament. And that was an incredible moral moment where people had to say, well, do I want this? No, they didn't want it, but they had to have it. And I'm afraid we do.
No, I was going to say ESG. If they can actually cut into ESG, that would be a very, very good move. It's become a sort of a religion.
Well, I can see why. I can see why, but it's dysfunctional. And the guys who do it, even the guys who do it as a living, say, all the metrics of it are all to cock. There's no single metric. What the Conservative government has laid out that it's going to do something about ESG, it should get on and do it. It should issue ESG some kind of regulation or rule that says the Europeans have done it. Well, they've said what the rule's going to be. No EU decision on social value or environmental value can militate against security. Now, they can only do that with government procurement, but by setting the lead, I think that's something we could do. No government procurement decision can empower a fund or methodology for an investment fund that sidelines military, sidelines defence. So I think get on with it. It frustrates me that they've not done it.
Yeah. I got a couple of personal questions for you.
Go
on. Before that, something you said at the beginning actually opened my eyes to something which I never fully understood, because I hadn't understood the history and the stepping stones that got Clement Attlee to the point that he reached, which I think history looks back fairly unkindly on it. But the way you've explained the build-up to it in the years before is very interesting. I'm going to try and find a good book that sets that. Somebody will have written that story.
There is one, bizarrely, it's a Labour MP, Nick Thomas Simmons, front bencher, who's written a biography of Attlee. But there's plenty. Go on.
Yeah, well, so the personal one is, so next 6 months is going to be stressful for anybody in politics. You're going to be supporting Labour, doing whatever you can. How do you keep fit? How do you de-stress? How do you sort of keep going?
On a personal level, I'm a male, age 64. I hope I don't look 64, but I am 64. And
How old is Byrne?
How old are you? Go on.
72.
Wow. So I go to the gym. I got told by my doctor again and again.
I did. I thought I'd done.
My doctor again and again and again said, somebody your age, carrying the weight you're doing, and with a bad heart, should be doing weight training. And I kept saying yes, and I'll go running. And it finally clicked to me that if I did weights, you go to the gym and lift weights, it's much better for you. So men, listen to this. That's what I do. And in terms of de-stressing, there is no de-stressing. I mean, it's not even that I'm going to be involved in politics. I am still somebody who's ticked. I've applied to be a Labour MP. I haven't got in anywhere so far, but there are places left. And if I become a candidate, then it's really stressful because every word you say is poured over. If not, I will be on the campaign trail in the hard places. I'll go to the places where I know there's still people to convince. Plymouth North, lots of military constituencies where people are still not bought. I completely understand why, and I will listen to any amount of hairdryer treatment from military and ex-military people as to why should they vote Labour, and I'll try and convince them.
Well, we'll wrap it up there because we've got to get. Paul, honestly, thank you so much indeed
a pleasure.
for joining us.
Yeah,
it's really good chance to get underneath it, and also, frankly, to have some straight talking because I know we push back a bit, but it's. Yeah. Thank you for at least.
That's the difference between a politician and a journalist.
Exactly.
Wait till I become a politician, and then I'll give you a full blanking. Yeah.
Thank you for your time.
Take care.